I thought it would be just another quiet office break, but a few unexpected words from my boss changed the way I saw myself and the place I'd worked for years. Stay with me, because what happened next surprised me more than anyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Which city are you in? And if stories like this speak to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. It truly helps us keep sharing meaningful stories together. I still remember the hum of the vending machine that afternoon, the soft flicker of fluorescent lights in the break room, and the way time seemed to slow down when I realized I wasn't alone. My name is Claire. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life learning how to be steady, dependable, and quiet at work. I'd been with the company for nearly 11 years, long enough to blend into the walls, long enough to be trusted, but rarely noticed. That day, I had stepped away from my desk with a cup of tea, hoping for 5 minutes of silence. The office had that late morning lull, when phones stopped ringing and keyboards softened into a gentle rhythm. I was standing by the small window, watching clouds drift over the parking lot, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" It was David, my boss. He wasn't an intimidating man, not really. Early 60s, calm voice, always neatly dressed, the kind of person who listened more than he spoke. Still, having him in the break room during an unscheduled moment felt unusual. I nodded and stepped aside, suddenly aware of how tightly I was holding my mug. We didn't talk at first. That silence could have felt awkward, but it didn't. It felt thoughtful, like we were both giving the moment the respect it deserved. He finally spoke, not about deadlines or numbers, but about the weather, about how the building always felt colder than it should. Small talk, but there was a softness in it. Then he looked at me, not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me feel seen. "You know," he said, "I don't think I've ever properly thanked you for what you bring to this place." I laughed lightly, brushing it off the way I always did. "I just do my job." "That's the thing," he replied. "You do much more than that." His words landed gently, but they stayed. No one had spoken to me like that at work before. Not in years, maybe ever. I felt something shift inside me, a quiet awareness I hadn't known I was missing. He talked about consistency, about how the office felt steadier when I was around. He mentioned moments I didn't even remember, small acts of patience or kindness that, to him, mattered. As he spoke, I realized this wasn't about praise. It was about recognition. I shared a little too, more than I usually would, about how work had become a place of routine after my kids grew up, how I sometimes wondered when I'd stopped noticing myself. He listened without interrupting, nodding slowly, as if every word had weight. When the break ended, neither of us rushed back. There was no crossing of lines, no awkwardness. Just a shared understanding that something honest had been exchanged. As I returned to my desk, the office looked the same, but I didn't feel the same inside it. I felt grounded, awake, and quietly curious about what it meant to be valued not for perfection, but for presence. That was the moment I realized some changes begin not with big events, but with simple words that arrive exactly when you're ready to hear them. The days that followed carried a different rhythm for me. Nothing outward had changed. The office still smelled faintly of coffee and copier ink, and the clock above the reception desk still ticked louder than it should have. Yet I walked in each morning with a new awareness, as if a window inside me had been opened just enough to let in fresh air. I noticed David more, not in a restless way, but with curiosity. How he paused before answering questions. How he remembered people's names and asked about their families. I realized he treated everyone with the same quiet respect, and somehow that made our brief conversation feel even more meaningful, not less. A few days later, he asked if I had time to sit in on a planning discussion. It wasn't unusual, but the invitation felt personal. We met in a small conference room with a round table and a plant that never quite thrived. Sunlight spilled across the surface, warming the space. As we talked through projects, he asked for my thoughts. Really asked. Not as a formality, but with attention. I found myself speaking with more confidence than usual, offering ideas I'd kept to myself for years. He didn't rush me. He didn't correct me. He considered what I said and built on it. At one point, he smiled and said, "That's exactly why I wanted you here." Something settled into place for me then. I wasn't invisible. I hadn't been all this time. I had simply learned to stand quietly, assuming that was expected of me. Later that afternoon, I caught my reflection in the glass door near my desk. There were lines around my eyes, strands of gray I no longer bothered to hide. But there was also a steadiness there, a calm strength I'd earned through years of showing up. For the first time in a long while, I felt proud of the woman looking back at me. During another break later that week, David and I crossed paths again. This time we both smiled, easy and familiar. We talked about ordinary things, books we'd read, music from years ago, how fast time seemed to move now. There was no rush to impress, no need to explain ourselves. I told him about my children, grown and scattered across different states, and how learning to let go had been harder than I expected. He shared stories about nearing retirement, about wondering what comes next when structure fades away. There was a shared understanding in that space between us. Two people standing at different crossroads, acknowledging change without fear. It felt respectful, grounded, and real. As I returned to my desk again, I realized something important. This wasn't about him, not entirely. It was about me allowing myself to be present, to accept acknowledgement without shrinking away from it. That realization stayed with me long after the office lights dimmed and the day ended, and I sensed quietly that this was only the beginning of a deeper understanding I hadn't yet fully named. By the time autumn settled in, the office felt smaller somehow, not in size but in distance between people. I moved through my days with a sense of intention I hadn't felt in years. It surprised me how something as simple as being truly heard could change the way I carried myself. David and I didn't seek each other out, not deliberately. Our conversations grew naturally, like a path worn smooth by repeated steps. Sometimes it was a quick exchange in the hallway, other times a longer discussion after a meeting when everyone else had filtered out. There was always a pause at the end, a shared breath before returning to our separate roles. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the office floor, he stopped by my desk. Most people had already gone home. The building felt quieter, almost reflective. "Claire," he said gently, "do you ever feel like life gives you moments to reconsider who you are?" The question caught me off guard. I leaned back in my chair, considering it honestly. "Yes," I said. "I think we just don't always recognize them when they happen." He nodded, resting his hand lightly on the back of a nearby chair, keeping his distance. "I think I'm in one of those moments." There was no urgency in his voice, no expectation placed on me. Just openness. I found myself sharing how I'd spent years defining myself by responsibilities, mother, employee, caretaker, until I wasn't sure what was left underneath. Saying it out loud felt like setting something down I'd been carrying for too long. He listened the way he always did, without interruption. When I finished, he smiled, not in encouragement or agreement, but in understanding. "I see you," he said simply. Those words stayed with me long after I drove home that night. I replayed them as I cooked dinner, as I folded laundry, as I sat quietly before bed. They weren't dramatic words, but they were honest ones. Over the next few weeks, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I spoke up more in meetings. I took lunch breaks without guilt. I laughed more easily. None of it felt forced. It felt earned. There was a moment during a team gathering when our eyes met across the room, and we both knew something had shifted. Not toward anything improper or confusing, but toward clarity. A mutual respect that acknowledged boundaries while honoring connection. I realized then that emotional closeness doesn't always demand action. Sometimes it simply asks for awareness. As winter approached, I understood that this experience wasn't about discovering something new, but about remembering something old. The part of me that deserved to be acknowledged. The part of him that valued sincerity over authority. And in that recognition, I felt steady, ready for whatever reflection the next chapter of my life would bring. By the time the holidays arrived, the office had taken on its usual festive glow. Tiny lights along the windows, a modest tree in the lobby, the faint smell of cinnamon from someone's Pop-Tart. But for me, the world felt a little brighter in ways unrelated to decorations. I carried with me a quiet warmth, a sense of being understood and valued that had grown slowly over the months. One afternoon, as I prepared to leave, David appeared near the elevator. The office was nearly empty, the soft hum of the heating system the only background noise. He didn't rush. He waited patiently, giving space while still making his presence felt. "Claire," he said, "I was thinking about the year, about how quickly it's passed. And I realized something I should have said sooner." I tilted my head, curious. He smiled, that calm, considered smile that seemed to make the air itself settle. "You've made a difference here," he said, "not just in the work, but in the way people feel around you, including me." I felt a quiet swell of emotion, not surprise, not excitement, but a deep recognition that someone had truly seen me. I realized then that this wasn't about flattery or attention. It was about acknowledgement, honesty, and connection, the kind that doesn't demand anything in return. Thank you, David," I said, choosing my words slowly. "That means more than you know." He nodded, as though understanding everything I didn't say aloud. We lingered there, sharing a moment of calm, two people aware of the passing year, aware of each other, aware of the subtle human threads that make work and life more meaningful. Walking home that evening, the city lights blurred softly in the early dusk. I thought about how much I had learned about myself in just a few months. About patience, presence, and allowing myself to be acknowledged. About how meaningful words, spoken at the right time, could shift the balance of a life quietly but profoundly. I realized that emotional connection doesn't always need drama to matter. Sometimes it shows up in small gestures, in shared conversations, in the comfort of being recognized without pretense. And sometimes it's enough to change the way you move through the world. By the time I reached my door, I understood something simple but powerful. Respect and understanding can illuminate corners of your life you didn't know were dim. And when that light touches you, it leaves a quiet, lasting warmth. That night, I went to bed feeling grounded, ready for the next chapter of my life, whatever that might bring. Because I had learned that being seen, really seen, is one of life's most unexpected and transformative gifts.